The bell rang sharply, signaling the start of an important exam. The classroom was filled with the sound of rustling papers and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Students settled into their seats, pens and pencils at the ready, their faces tense with concentration. Among them was Marcus, a bright and hard-working black student who always sat in the front row. His neatly arranged desk reflected his meticulous nature, and his eyes focused intently on the exam paper in front of him. Mrs. Simmons, the teacher, stood at the front of the room. She was a tall, stern woman with an air of authority. Her sharp gaze swept across the room, but when it landed on Marcus, her expression shifted slightly. It wasn't outright disdain, but there was a hint of disapproval, as if she questioned his very presence in her class. "Begin," she said coldly, her voice cutting through the silence. Marcus picked up his pen and began writing. He had spent weeks preparing for this test, knowing how important it was for his grades and future aspirations. The questions were challenging, but Marcus was confident. He worked methodically, his mind focused and clear. Mrs. Simmons walked slowly between the rows of desks, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. She stopped briefly behind Marcus, peering over his shoulder. She watched him write, her lips pressing into a thin line. Marcus felt her presence, but didn't let it distract him. He continued to write, determined to give his best. The minutes ticked by, and soon Mrs. Simmons called time. "Pens down. Bring your papers to the front," she instructed. Marcus carefully placed his completed paper on top of the pile and returned to his seat. As Mrs. Simmons collected the exams, she glanced at Marcus's paper, her eyes narrowing. She muttered something under her breath, but Marcus couldn't hear it. He noticed her expression but chose not to react. He believed his work would speak for itself. The next day, Mrs. Simmons handed back the graded exams. She walked through the rows, placing the papers face down on each desk. When she reached Marcus, she hesitated for a moment before setting his paper in front of him. Her face gave nothing away. Marcus flipped the paper over and froze. His heart sank as he saw the large red F scrawled across the top of the page. The marks on the individual answers were harsh, with words like incorrect and poor reasoning written in bold letters. Confused and disheartened, Marcus quickly scanned his answers. He was certain he had done well, and yet the grade told a different story. He raised his hand, his voice calm but firm. "Mrs. Simmons, may I speak to you about my grade?" The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward him. Mrs. Simmons sighed dramatically, as if his request were a great inconvenience. "What is it, Marcus?" she said, her tone sharp. "I reviewed my answers," Marcus said respectfully, "and I believe there might be a mistake in the grading. Could you please look at it again?" Mrs. Simmons crossed her arms and leaned against her desk. "A mistake, you say?" she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Marcus, not everyone is meant to excel. Perhaps this is a lesson for you to focus on your strengths instead of aiming too high." The words stung, but Marcus remained composed. "I don't mean to challenge you, Mrs. Simmons," he said. "I just want to understand where I went wrong so I can improve." Mrs. Simmons smirked slightly. "Improvement? Marcus, sometimes we have to accept that our best may not be good enough. You should focus on realistic goals." The room was silent except for the faint scribbling of a few students pretending to be busy. Marcus felt the weight of his classmates' stares, but he refused to back down. "I believe in setting high goals, Mrs. Simmons," he said. "If I made mistakes, I want to learn from them." Mrs. Simmons walked over and picked up his paper. She held it up as if it were evidence in a courtroom. "Since you're so determined, let's review it together," she said. Her tone was mocking, but Marcus nodded, willing to face whatever came next. She pointed to one of his answers. "Here you've provided an overcomplicated explanation. The correct answer is much simpler." Marcus looked at the answer and carefully explained his reasoning. His logic was sound, but Mrs. Simmons dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "You're overthinking. Simplicity is key, she said, moving on to the next question without further discussion. The review continued for several minutes, with Marcus defending his answers and Mrs. Simmons brushing them off with vague criticisms. By the end, it was clear that she had no intention of reconsidering the grade. "Let this be a lesson, Marcus," she said, handing the paper back to him. "Sometimes we need to know our limits and stay within them." Marcus clenched the paper in his hand, his frustration building. He felt the injustice of the situation, but knew that arguing further would achieve nothing. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Simmons," he said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. As he walked back to his seat, he resolved not to let this defeat him. He sat down, opened his notebook, and wrote a single sentence at the top of the page: "Prove them wrong." After the bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Marcus walked home, his backpack slung over his shoulder. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalks of his neighborhood. The houses were small, with chipped paint and overgrown yards, a testament to the financial struggles faced by the families living there. Marcus's home was no different, a modest single-story house with a sagging roof and creaky front steps. As he opened the door, the familiar scent of home greeted him. Inside, his mother, Mrs. Johnson, stood at the stove, stirring a pot of soup. She looked up and smiled warmly, though the lines on her face revealed the stress of raising a family on a tight budget. "Hi, baby. How was school?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Marcus hesitated, not wanting to burden her with the events of the day. "It was fine," he replied, forcing a small smile. His younger sister, Lila, ran into the room, clutching a worn-out notebook. "Marcus, can you help me with my math homework?" she asked, her big brown eyes hopeful. "In a bit, Lila," Marcus said, patting her head gently. "Let me finish up some stuff first." He headed to his small bedroom, which he shared with his younger brother, Jamal. The room was cramped, with two twin beds pushed against opposite walls and a small desk crammed in the corner. Marcus dropped his backpack on the bed and sat down, staring at the crumpled test paper still clenched in his hand. The red F seemed to taunt him, but he folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. After a quick snack, Marcus changed into his work clothes, a faded polo shirt and khakis. He worked part-time at a local grocery store, stacking shelves and bagging groceries to help his family make ends meet. The job was tiring and the pay was modest, but Marcus never complained. He knew his family needed every penny. As he walked to the store, his mind wandered. He thought about the unfair grade Mrs. Simmons had given him and how her words echoed in his head. "Know your limits." But Marcus refused to accept that his potential was limited. He had dreams, big dreams, of one day becoming a school principal or even a superintendent. He wanted to create a better environment for students like him, students who were often overlooked or underestimated. At the grocery store, Marcus worked diligently, smiling at customers and helping his co-workers. Many of them were older men and women who often shared their own stories of struggle and perseverance. "Keep working hard, kid," one co-worker said as they stocked shelves together. "You've got something special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Marcus nodded, the words offering a small glimmer of encouragement. Later that evening, the family gathered around the dinner table. The meal was simple, soup and bread, but it was filled with warmth and laughter. Marcus's father, Mr. Johnson, worked long hours as a construction worker, and his rough hands and tired eyes showed the toll it took on him. "So, Marcus," his father began, tearing a piece of bread, "how's school going? You still aiming for that principal dream?" Marcus hesitated, glancing at his mother, who gave him a reassuring smile. "It's going okay," he said carefully. "Some days are harder than others." His father nodded knowingly. "Nothing worth having comes easy, son. You've got to fight for it." Mrs. Johnson chimed in, her voice gentle but firm. "Education is your way out, Marcus. You're smart, and you've got a good head on your shoulders. Don't let anyone take that away from you." Jamal, who was only 10, looked up at Marcus with admiration. "You're going to be a principal, right, Marcus? And then I can tell everyone my big brother's the boss." Marcus chuckled, ruffling Jamal's hair. "That's the plan, little man." The family's unwavering belief in him fueled Marcus's determination. He knew they were counting on him to succeed, not just for himself, but for them as well. After dinner, while the rest of the family settled down for the night, Marcus sat at the small desk in his room. A dim lamp cast a warm glow over his notebooks and textbooks. He opened one of his notebooks, flipping to the back pages where he had scribbled his goals. At the top of the page he had written, "Dream big, work hard." Below it he listed his aspirations: graduate with honors, go to college, become a school principal, make a difference. The words reminded him of why he was working so hard. He picked up his pen and started solving math problems, reviewing essays, and reading chapters from his history textbook. The hours stretched on, and Marcus fought the urge to sleep. He knew that every minute spent studying brought him closer to his dreams. The neighborhood Marcus lived in was filled with people facing similar struggles. Many of the kids at his school came from families like his, where every dollar mattered and every opportunity was hard-earned. Marcus often volunteered at a local community center, helping younger kids with their homework. It was his way of giving back and staying connected to his roots. One day, an older woman at the center, Mrs. Carter, pulled him aside. "Marcus," she said, her voice kind but firm, "I've been watching you. You're going to do great things one day. Don't let anyone dim your light." Her words stuck with him, becoming a mantra he repeated to himself whenever doubt crept in. Despite his determination, there were moments when the weight of his responsibilities felt overwhelming. Balancing school, work, and family wasn't easy, and there were days when Marcus wondered if he was doing enough. But then he would think of his parents, who worked tirelessly to provide for him and his siblings. He would think of Lila, who looked up to him for help with her homework, and Jamal, who believed in his dream of becoming a principal. Most of all, he would think of the other kids in his school, kids like him who deserved a fair chance at success. Marcus knew that his struggles were shaping him into someone stronger. Every challenge he faced, every late night spent studying, and every shift at the grocery store was preparing him for the future he envisioned. As he closed his notebook that night and lay down to sleep, Marcus whispered to himself, "One day I'll make it, not just for me, but for all of us." And with that thought, he drifted off, ready to face whatever the next day would bring. Mrs. Simmons sat at her desk, a cup of steaming black coffee in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. Her neatly arranged desk, with its polished surface and perfectly aligned pens, reflected her rigid and exacting personality. The classroom was quiet now, the students having left for lunch, and she allowed herself a moment to relax before her next class. But even in this moment of solitude, her mind was sharp and critical. She flipped through the stack of essays submitted by her students, her red pen at the ready. As she skimmed through Marcus's essay, her lips pursed tightly. His handwriting was neat, his arguments well-structured, but there was something about him that irritated her. Perhaps it was his quiet confidence, or the way he refused to accept the limits she subtly placed on him. Whatever it was, she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge his potential. "Overambitious," she muttered under her breath, circling a paragraph and writing a curt comment in the margin. "Weak analysis." Biases in the classroom. Mrs. Simmons' interactions with her students were starkly divided. She reserved her praise for the students she believed were destined to succeed, those who came from wealthier families or fit her preconceived notions of what a bright student should be. In one of her classes, she called on Emily, a quiet but diligent student from an affluent family. "Emily, your essay was exemplary as always," she said, her tone warm and encouraging. Emily beamed with pride, her confidence boosted by the praise. Later in the same lesson, she turned to Marcus. "And Marcus," she said, her voice losing its warmth, "your arguments lack depth. I suggest you put in more effort next time." The class fell silent, and Marcus nodded, his face betraying none of the frustration he felt. This was a recurring pattern. Students like Marcus, who didn't fit into Mrs. Simmons' narrow vision of success, were often met with criticism, while others were praised for mediocre work and undermining minority students. It wasn't just Marcus who faced Mrs. Simmons's biases. Other students from minority backgrounds noticed her unfair treatment as well. In one instance, she announced the results of a classroom debate competition. The winning team, led by a well-spoken student named Sarah, had been clear and concise in their arguments. But Sarah, who was from a minority background, received little acknowledgement. "Good effort," Mrs. Simmons said dismissively, before turning to praise the runner-up team, led by students she considered more capable. Sarah's face fell, but like Marcus, she didn't challenge Mrs. Simmons. The unspoken rule in her classroom was clear: you didn't question her authority. Conversations in the staff room. In the staff room, Mrs. Simmons often revealed her true colors. Over cups of coffee and between bites of sandwiches, she would discuss her students with her colleagues, her biases shining through in her words. "Marcus Johnson," she began one day, setting her coffee cup down with a sigh. "That boy has no discipline. He's always aiming too high, thinking he's better than he is. It's almost laughable." Another teacher, Mr. Brown, looked up from his notes. "Marcus, he's one of the brightest students I've taught. He's hardworking and thoughtful." "Are you sure we're talking about the same student?" Mrs. Simmons scoffed. "Bright? Hardworking? Maybe in your subject, but in my class, he's mediocre at best. Always overcomplicating things, trying to show off. He needs to learn his place." Mr. Brown frowned, but chose not to argue. He knew Mrs. Simmons's stubbornness well. On another occasion, during a discussion about student potential, Mrs. Simmons dismissed the idea of Marcus excelling in leadership roles. "Some students just aren't cut out for those kinds of positions," she said with a knowing smile. "It's not a matter of effort. It's just reality." Building her biases. Mrs. Simmons' prejudices were not overtly aggressive, but manifested in subtle ways that left lasting impact. During parent-teacher conferences, she would give glowing reviews to certain students while barely acknowledging the efforts of others. When Marcus's parents met with her, they came with hope and pride, eager to hear about their son's progress. But Mrs. Simmons' tone was clipped and distant. "Marcus has potential," she began, "but he struggles to focus on what's realistic for him. He tends to overreach, and I worry that it might lead to disappointment." Mrs. Johnson frowned. "Marcus has always been ambitious. Isn't that a good thing?" "Ambition is fine," Mrs. Simmons replied, her smile thin, "but it has to be grounded in reality." Mr. Johnson, sensing the underlying bias, clenched his fists under the table but remained calm. "Thank you for your feedback," he said, his voice steady. "We'll continue to encourage Marcus to do his best." The impact on students. Mrs. Simmons' behavior created an environment where students like Marcus felt undervalued. Her words carried weight, and her criticism often lingered in their minds long after the school day ended. For Marcus, her constant dismissal fueled his determination. He began to see her words not as limitations, but as challenges to overcome. He shared his frustrations with his family, who reminded him that her opinion didn't define his worth. "She doesn't see what you're capable of," his mother said one evening, "but that's her loss. You just keep proving her wrong." Marcus took her advice to heart, channeling his frustration into his studies and extracurricular activities. He became more involved in his community, volunteering at local events and mentoring younger students. Every achievement felt like a step toward proving Mrs. Simmons wrong. A defining moment. One day during a group project, Marcus and his classmates presented their work to the class. Marcus, as the group leader, spoke with confidence and clarity, outlining their ideas and findings. The class was impressed, and even the other teachers who had been invited to observe nodded in approval. But when it came time for feedback, Mrs. Simmons focused solely on minor errors. "Your presentation was decent," she said, "but you missed some key points. Next time, try to keep it simple." The contrast between her feedback and the praise from others was stark, but Marcus remained composed. "Thank you for your feedback," he said, his voice steady. After class, one of his classmates approached him. "Marcus, you were amazing," she said. "Don't let her get to you." Marcus smiled. "I won't," he replied. "She's just one voice. There are others who believe in me." The foundation for change. As Marcus continued to excel, Mrs. Simmons' biases became increasingly apparent to others. Teachers like Mr. Brown began to advocate for Marcus, highlighting his achievements and potential. In a staff meeting, Mr. Brown brought up Marcus's name. "We need to talk about students like Marcus Johnson," he said. "He's a leader in the making, and we should be supporting him." Mrs. Simmons frowned but said nothing. For the first time she felt her authority being questioned. The sun had just begun to set as Marcus made his way home from the library, his backpack heavy with textbooks and notes. The day had been particularly grueling. Mrs. Simmons' latest round of criticism weighed heavily on his mind, and for a fleeting moment doubt began to creep in. "Maybe she's right," Marcus thought as he kicked a stray pebble along the sidewalk. "Maybe I'm just not good enough." As he turned the corner near the community park, he noticed an elderly man sitting on a bench under the shade of a large oak tree. The man wore a simple, well-worn suit, his hands resting on a cane. He had an air of calm wisdom about him, his eyes following the children playing in the park. "Evening, young man," the man said as Marcus walked by. Marcus paused, startled by the greeting. "Good evening, sir," he replied politely. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," the man continued, his voice warm and inviting. "Mind sitting down for a moment? Sometimes talking helps." Marcus hesitated. He didn't usually stop to talk to strangers, but there was something reassuring about the man's presence. He sat down cautiously, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I'm just tired," Marcus admitted after a moment. "Tired of trying so hard and feeling like it's never enough." The man nodded thoughtfully. "I've been there," he said, "more times than I can count. What's your name, son?" "Marcus Johnson." "Well, Marcus, I'm Mr. Carter. Nice to meet you." He extended a hand, which Marcus shook firmly. "What's got you so tired, Marcus?" Mr. Carter asked. Marcus hesitated before answering. "There's this teacher at school. No matter how hard I try, she always finds a way to tear me down. She says I'm aiming too high, that I need to know my limits." Mr. Carter's expression softened. "And what do you think? Do you believe her?" Marcus looked down at his hands. "Sometimes. I don't know. I want to believe I can prove her wrong, but it's hard." Mr. Carter leaned back, tapping his cane lightly on the ground. "You know, Marcus, your story reminds me of someone I knew a long time ago, a young man named Thomas." "Thomas?" Marcus asked, intrigued. "Yes, Thomas," Mr. Carter said, smiling faintly. "He was bright, hardworking, and full of dreams. But like you, he had people in his life who doubted him. Teachers, employers, even some of his own family. They told him he was too ambitious, that he'd never amount to much." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. "What happened to him?" "Thomas didn't let their words define him," Mr. Carter continued. "He worked harder than anyone else. He studied late into the night, took on jobs no one else wanted, and used every failure as a lesson. It wasn't easy. There were times he wanted to give up. But he kept going." "And did he succeed?" Marcus asked. Mr. Carter's smile widened. "He did. Thomas became one of the most respected leaders in his community. He built schools, mentored young people, and proved every single doubter wrong. But more importantly, he showed others that their potential wasn't limited by what others thought of them. Marcus sat silently, processing the story. "Marcus," Mr. Carter said gently, "great leaders aren't born. They're made through struggle, perseverance, and the courage to believe in themselves. Thomas wasn't special because he never failed. He was special because he never stopped trying." The words resonated deeply with Marcus. For the first time, he felt a flicker of hope reignite within him. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," Marcus said, standing up. "I needed to hear that." Mr. Carter nodded. "Remember, Marcus, your journey is yours to define. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, and if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here most evenings." That night, Marcus sat at his desk, his notebook open in front of him. He wrote a single sentence at the top of the page. "Prove them wrong." Below it, he began listing his goals. Improve his grades in every subject. Join clubs and organizations to develop leadership skills. Volunteer in the community. Apply for scholarships to attend a top college. One day become a principal and make a difference. Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose as he looked at the list. The next morning, Marcus woke up earlier than usual. He reviewed his notes before school, determined to stay ahead in his classes. He began asking more questions in class, participating actively in discussions, and seeking extra help when needed. Outside of school, he joined the student council, where he quickly gained a reputation for being reliable and insightful. He also volunteered at the local community center, helping younger kids with their homework and organizing events. At the grocery store where he worked part-time, his manager noticed his dedication. "Marcus, you're one of the hardest workers I've got," the manager said one evening. "If you ever need a recommendation, let me know." Despite his newfound determination, the road wasn't easy. Mrs. Simmons continued to criticize him, her comments as sharp as ever. "Marcus, this essay is overcomplicated," she said one day, handing back his paper. "You need to simplify your thoughts." Marcus bit back his frustration and took her feedback as a challenge. He revised his work, sought advice from other teachers, and slowly began to see improvement. There were also moments of self-doubt, late nights when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. But each time he reminded himself of Mr. Carter's words. Great leaders aren't born, they're made. Over time, Marcus began to see the fruits of his labor. His grades improved, and his teachers, apart from Mrs. Simmons, began to take notice of his efforts. "Keep up the good work, Marcus," Mr. Brown, his history teacher, said one day. "You've got a bright future ahead of you." At the community center, parents began thanking him for helping their children. "You're such a positive influence," one mother said. Each small victory fueled his motivation, reinforcing his belief that he was on the right path. One evening, Marcus returned to the park to find Mr. Carter sitting on his usual bench. "Good to see you again, Marcus," Mr. Carter said, smiling. "How's the journey?" "It's tough," Marcus admitted, "but I'm making progress, thanks to you." Mr. Carter chuckled. "Don't thank me, son. You're the one doing the work. Just remember, every great leader starts somewhere. You're building something incredible, even if you don't see it yet." Marcus nodded, feeling a sense of pride and determination. By the end of the year, Marcus had accomplished many of the goals he had written in his notebook. His grades were among the highest in his class. He had become a leader in the student council, and his volunteer work had made a tangible impact in his community. He also began applying for scholarships, writing essays about his experiences and aspirations. Each application brought him one step closer to his dream of attending college and becoming a principal. The day Marcus received his high school diploma was one of the proudest moments of his life. His family sat in the audience, cheering loudly as his name was called. His mother wiped away tears, and his father clapped so hard it seemed like he might hurt his hands. For Marcus, this was more than just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of the countless hours of studying, working, and pushing through challenges. But the journey was far from over. Marcus knew that attending college would be the next step toward his dream of becoming a principal. However, financial challenges loomed large. Late one evening, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his parents, reviewing college brochures. His mother's eyes lingered on the tuition fees printed in bold. "Marcus," she said softly, "these colleges are expensive. We want you to go, but we don't have this kind of money." "I know, Mom," Marcus replied, his voice steady, "but I'll figure it out. Scholarships, part-time jobs, whatever it takes, I'll make it happen." He applied to multiple schools, carefully writing essays about his journey, his dreams, and the lessons he had learned along the way. He spent hours refining each application, ensuring his story stood out. Weeks turned into months, and the responses began to trickle in. Some were rejections, which stung but didn't deter him. Then came the letter from a prestigious university that offered him a partial scholarship based on his academic achievements. "We'll make it work," his father said firmly. "Between this scholarship and your part-time job, we'll get you through." Arriving on campus was both exciting and overwhelming for Marcus. The university was massive, with sprawling green lawns and towering brick buildings. The diversity of students was inspiring, yet Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was an outsider. His first semester was tough. Classes were more challenging than anything he had faced in high school, and the workload seemed never-ending. On top of that, he worked evenings at the campus library to cover his remaining expenses. One day, after a particularly grueling week of exams and work, Marcus sat alone in the cafeteria, his head resting in his hands. He felt exhausted, both physically and mentally. "Hey, you okay?" a voice asked. Marcus looked up to see a fellow student, a tall young man named David, holding a tray of food. "Yeah, just tired," Marcus replied. David sat down across from him. "I hear you. College can feel like a marathon sometimes, but you're not alone, man. Everyone struggles, even if they don't show it." That simple conversation marked the beginning of a friendship that would carry Marcus through some of his toughest moments. David, along with a small group of supportive friends, became his lifeline, offering encouragement and a sense of belonging. While most professors and students were welcoming, Marcus occasionally encountered subtle forms of racism that reminded him of Mrs. Simmons. In one of his classes, a professor often seemed to dismiss Marcus's contributions during discussions, favoring other students. One day, after Marcus presented a well-researched project, the professor commented, "You've exceeded expectations, Marcus. I didn't think this topic would resonate with you." The words stung, but Marcus didn't let them discourage him. Instead, he channeled his frustration into proving himself further. He sought guidance from other professors who valued his work and used their feedback to improve. Outside of class, there were moments when Marcus felt the weight of being one of the few black students in certain spaces. He noticed the stares, the hesitant conversations, and the occasional assumptions about his background. One evening, while studying with David and another friend, Sarah, he shared his feelings. "Sometimes it feels like I have to work twice as hard just to be seen as equal," he admitted. David nodded. "I can't pretend to understand exactly what you're going through, but I do know this. You've got what it takes to succeed, no matter what anyone else thinks." During his second year, Marcus took an education course that reignited his passion for teaching and leadership. The professor, Dr. Patel, noticed Marcus's enthusiasm and dedication. "Marcus," Dr. Patel said after class one day, "have you ever considered pursuing a career in education?" Marcus smiled. "It's actually my dream to become a principal one day." Dr. Patel nodded thoughtfully. "I see potential in you. Let's work together to make that dream a reality." With Dr. Patel's guidance, Marcus began to explore opportunities to gain experience in education. He volunteered as a tutor for underprivileged students in the nearby community and joined a campus organization focused on education reform. Despite his growing achievements, Marcus still struggled with self-doubt. There were moments when the pressure felt insurmountable, when he questioned whether he was truly capable of reaching his goals. One such moment came during his junior year when he faced a particularly difficult semester. Balancing his coursework, part-time job, and extracurricular activities left him feeling. The school was abuzz with rumors of change. The previous principal had retired and a new one was set to take the reins. The announcement had been made weeks ago, but no one knew much about the incoming leader except that he was young, ambitious, and highly recommended. The staff gathered in the auditorium for a meeting to formally welcome the new principal. Teachers whispered among themselves, speculating about what kind of leader he might be. "I hope he's someone who understands the challenges we face," Mr. Brown, the history teacher, said to Mrs. Carter, a veteran math teacher. "Let's hope he's not one of those who sits in the office all day," Mrs. Carter replied with a chuckle. Mrs. Simmons, sitting at the front, adjusted her glasses and smoothed her blazer. She had seen many principals come and go, and didn't expect this one to be any different. The chatter quieted as the assistant principal stepped onto the stage. She cleared her throat and spoke into the microphone. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's my honor to introduce our new principal, someone who has an exceptional background in education and a clear vision for the future of this school. Please welcome Mr. Marcus Johnson." The name echoed through the auditorium, followed by a moment of stunned silence. From the back of the room, Marcus appeared, walking confidently toward the stage. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his posture straight, and his expression composed yet warm. The teachers watched him with a mix of curiosity and surprise, their murmurs growing louder. At the front, Mrs. Simmons froze, her face turned pale as the name registered. "Marcus Johnson?" she whispered to herself, gripping the edge of her chair. Marcus climbed the stage and stood at the podium, scanning the room. His eyes briefly met Mrs. Simmons, and for a split second, an unspoken acknowledgment passed between them. "Good morning, everyone," Marcus began, his voice steady and confident. "It's an honor to be here as your new principal. This school holds a special place in my heart. It's where I grew up, where I learned some of my most important lessons, not just in academics, but in life." The teachers exchanged glances, sensing a deeper meaning in his words. "I want to thank each of you for the work you do every day," Marcus continued. "Teaching is one of the hardest jobs there is, and I know that firsthand. My goal as principal is to support you, to empower our students, and to create an environment where everyone has the opportunity to succeed." The room erupted in applause. Marcus stepped back from the podium, allowing the assistant principal to take over. As the meeting ended and the teachers began to leave, whispers filled the air. "Did you see how young he is?" one teacher said. "I heard he graduated with honors and worked as an assistant principal at a big city school," another added. "He's impressive," Mr. Brown said with a smile. "I think he's exactly what this school needs." Mrs. Simmons, however, remained seated, her mind racing. She remembered Marcus vividly, his quiet determination, his respectful protests against her criticisms, and the look in his eyes when she told him to know his limits. "Principal," she muttered under her breath, still trying to process the reality of the situation. Later that day, Marcus walked through the familiar halls of the school, memories flooding back with every step. The faded lockers, the worn-out bulletin boards, the echoes of laughter and footsteps. It all felt surreal. As he turned a corner, he saw Mrs. Simmons standing outside her classroom, organizing papers. She looked up and froze when their eyes met. "Mrs. Simmons," Marcus said, his tone polite but firm. "Mr. Johnson," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Or should I say, Principal Johnson?" Marcus smiled faintly. "It's good to see you again." Mrs. Simmons hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "You've come a long way," she finally said. "I have," Marcus replied, "and I've never forgotten the lessons I learned here. both the good and the bad. There was a moment of silence as the weight of his words hung in the air. "Marcus, she began, but he held up a hand. "Let's save this conversation for another time," he said gently. "I have a lot of work to do, and so do you." Mrs. Simmons nodded, relief and apprehension mingling in her expression. The following week, Marcus called an assembly to address the students and staff. The auditorium was packed, the energy palpable as everyone waited to hear from their new principal. Marcus stood at the podium, his presence commanding yet approachable. "Good morning, everyone," he began. "When I was a student at this school, I often felt like I was fighting an uphill battle. There were times when I doubted myself, when I wondered if my dreams were too big or unrealistic." The students listened intently, many of them relating to his words. "But I want each of you to know something," Marcus continued. "Your potential is limitless. Don't let anyone define what you can or cannot achieve. Work hard, believe in yourself, and surround yourself with people who lift you up." The applause was thunderous, the students rising to their feet in admiration. A few days later, Mrs. Simmons requested a private meeting with Marcus. She entered his office nervously, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. "Please have a seat," Marcus said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Thank you," Mrs. Simmons said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Mrs. Simmons broke the silence. "Marcus, I want to apologize for the way I treated you when you were my student. I see now that I was wrong, and I regret the things I said and did." Marcus leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Simmons, I appreciate your apology. But this isn't just about me. It's about every student who's ever felt underestimated or dismissed. As educators, we have a responsibility to lift our students up, not tear them down." Mrs. Simmons nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "You're right," she said, "and I want to do better." Marcus smiled. "That's all I ask. Let's work together to create a school where every student feels valued." Under Marcus's leadership, the school began to transform. He implemented new policies to promote inclusivity, equity, and student empowerment. Teachers underwent training on cultural competence and empathy, and students were given more opportunities to voice their concerns and ideas. Mrs. Simmons, though initially hesitant, embraced the changes. She began mentoring struggling students, using her experience to guide them rather than criticize them. One day, Marcus passed by her classroom and saw her helping a student after hours. She looked up and smiled, a silent acknowledgment of their shared journey. One evening, as Marcus sat in his office, he opened the drawer of his desk and pulled out his old notebook. The words he had written years ago, "Prove them wrong," still resonated with him. He thought about how far he had come, from the boy who sat in Mrs. Simmons's classroom to the man who now led the school. He thought about the students who walked the halls, each with their own dreams and challenges, and he felt a deep sense of purpose. "This is just the beginning," he said to himself, closing the notebook with a satisfied smile. And with that, Marcus leaned back in his chair, ready to continue building the legacy he had dreamed of for so long. The staff meeting arrived with a buzz of anticipation. Teachers filed into the library, which had been arranged to accommodate the entire teaching staff. The air was filled with low murmurs as they speculated about what the new principal, Marcus Johnson, would say. Mrs. Carter, the math teacher, whispered to Mr. Brown, "I've heard he's a brilliant speaker. Let's see if he lives up to the hype." Mrs. Simmons sat quietly in the second row, her hands folded in her lap. She had barely spoken to Marcus since their brief interaction in the hallway, and a mix of nervousness and curiosity swirled in her mind. At precisely 9 a.m., Marcus entered the room. Dressed in a tailored suit, his confident stride and warm demeanor commanded attention. He walked to the podium at the front of the room, placed his notes down, and looked out at the gathered staff. "Good morning," Marcus began, his voice steady and welcoming. "Thank you all for being here today. I know the start of a new school year can be overwhelming, but it's also a time of great opportunity, a chance to set the tone for what we want to achieve together. Marcus took a moment to acknowledge the dedication of the teachers in the room. I want to start by saying how much I respect and admire the work you do every single day, he said, his eyes scanning the room. Teaching is not just a job, it's a calling. You have the power to shape lives, to inspire curiosity, and to open doors that many of our students didn't even know existed. The teachers nodded in agreement, their expressions softening. Marcus's sincerity was palpable, and it was clear he understood the challenges they faced. Marcus placed his hands on the podium and leaned forward slightly, his tone becoming more serious. When I think about this school, he began, I think about the potential it holds. Potential not just for our students, but for all of us, for the entire community. This school can be a place where every student feels seen, valued, and empowered. But to achieve that, we need to create an environment built on 3 core principles: respect, equality, and opportunity. He paused, letting the words sink in. Respect, he continued, is the foundation of everything we do. Respect for our students, for each other, and for the diverse backgrounds and experiences that make this community unique. Every child who walks through our doors deserves to feel respected, not because of their grades, their background, or their behavior, but because they are human beings with inherent worth. There was a ripple of agreement among the staff, and even Mrs. Simmons shifted in her seat, her expression thoughtful. Equality, Marcus said, his voice firm but compassionate, is not just a buzzword. It's a commitment to ensuring that every student has the same access to resources, support, and opportunities. It means recognizing that some students face barriers that others don't, and it's our job to help them overcome those barriers. He glanced at the teachers in the room, his gaze lingering on a few faces, though he avoided looking directly at Mrs. Simmons. As educators, we have to challenge our own assumptions and biases, he said. We have to ask ourselves, are we giving every student a fair chance? Are we truly seeing their potential, or are we letting stereotypes and preconceived notions cloud our judgment? A hush fell over the room. Marcus's words were gentle but carried weight, and many of the teachers seemed to reflect on their own practices. Marcus straightened, his voice taking on an inspiring tone. Finally, opportunity. That's why we're all here, isn't it? To give our students opportunities they might not have otherwise. To show them that their future is not defined by their circumstances, but by their dreams and their determination. He smiled, his eyes lighting up as he spoke. I know this to be true because I've lived it, he said, his voice softening. I sat in these classrooms as a student not so long ago. I know what it's like to feel overlooked, to feel like your dreams are too big or unrealistic. But I also know the power of a teacher who believes in you, the power of someone who sees your potential and encourages you to reach for it. Without naming names, Marcus began to reference the challenges he faced as a student, weaving his experiences into his message. There were times when I felt like I didn't belong, he said. Times when I was told, directly or indirectly, that I should lower my expectations, that I should know my limits. Mrs. Simmons shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands tightening around her notebook. But I also had people who believed in me, Marcus continued. Mentors, teachers, family members, people who reminded me that my worth wasn't determined by someone else's opinion. Those voices gave me the strength to keep going, even when it was hard. His words were met with a wave of quiet nods from the staff. Many of them could see their own students in Marcus's story, and it reinforced the importance of their roles. Marcus leaned forward again, his tone becoming more passionate. My vision for this school is simple, he said. I want it to be a place where every student feels like they matter, a place where every teacher feels supported and empowered to do their best work, a place where we don't just talk about respect, equality, and opportunity. We live it every single day. He paused, looking out at the room with intensity. But I can't do this alone, he said. This vision requires all of us. It requires us to work together, to hold each other accountable, and to never lose sight of why we're here, to serve our students. The staff's reaction. When Marcus finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. Teachers stood, clapping enthusiastically, their faces lit with a mix of admiration and inspiration. "That was incredible," Mr. Brown said to Mrs. Carter. "I think he's exactly what this school needed." Mrs. Simmons clapped along with the rest, but her expression was subdued. She knew that Marcus's words had been aimed in part at people like her, people who had underestimated students like him. After the meeting, Marcus returned to his office. He sat at his desk, reflecting on the speech he had just given. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he felt confident that he had taken the first step. Across the hall, Mrs. Simmons sat in her classroom, replaying Marcus's words in her mind. She thought about the students she had dismissed over the years, the assumptions she had made, and the impact her actions might have had. For the first time in a long while, she felt a pang of regret and a desire to do better. In the weeks that followed, Marcus's vision began to take shape. He worked closely with the staff to implement new policies and programs designed to promote respect, equality, and opportunity. Teachers underwent training on cultural competence and implicit bias, and the school introduced mentorship programs to support students from underprivileged backgrounds. Marcus made a point to be visible and approachable, walking the halls, visiting classrooms, and talking to students. His presence inspired both staff and students, and slowly but surely, the school began to transform. It was a quiet Friday afternoon, and the school day was winding down. Marcus sat in his office, reviewing the plans for a new mentorship program he was launching. The knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Marcus said, glancing up. The door opened slowly, and Mrs. Simmons stepped in. Her usual confident demeanor was replaced by a nervous hesitation. She held a folder in her hands, her knuckles slightly white from gripping it too tightly. "Principal Johnson," she began, her voice quieter than usual. "Do you have a moment? I'd like to speak with you privately." Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Of course, Mrs. Simmons. Please, have a seat." She sat down, smoothing the fabric of her blazer as if trying to steady herself. "I've been meaning to talk to you," Mrs. Simmons said, her voice faltering slightly. "Ever since you returned to the school as principal." Marcus nodded, his expression calm but unreadable. "I figured this conversation would happen eventually. I'm glad you decided to come." Mrs. Simmons looked down at the folder in her lap, then back up at Marcus. "I wanted to start by saying, congratulations. You've clearly worked hard to get to where you are, and it's well-deserved." "Thank you," Marcus replied simply. There was a pause, the silence in the room thick with unspoken words. "I've been reflecting on the past," Mrs. Simmons began, her tone cautious. "Back when you were a student here, I might have been hard on you, but, you see, it wasn't personal. I've always believed in pushing students to be realistic about their goals, to understand their limits." Marcus listened intently, his hands folded on the desk. He didn't interrupt, allowing her to continue. "I thought I was doing what was best," she said, her words coming faster now, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as him. "I wanted to prepare you for the challenges of the real world. It's not easy out there, and I thought I was helping you by being honest." She paused, her eyes searching Marcus's face for a reaction. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice steady and measured. "Mrs. Simmons, I appreciate you coming here and being willing to talk about this. But I need to be honest with you. Back then, it didn't feel like you were trying to help me. It felt like you were trying to hold me back." Mrs. Simmons' face tightened, but she didn't look away. "You told me to know my limits," Marcus continued, his tone calm but firm. "You dismissed my ideas and criticized my efforts in ways that didn't feel constructive. I remember leaving your classroom feeling like I wasn't good enough, like no matter how hard I tried, I would never meet your expectations." He paused, letting his words sink in. That wasn't just about academics. It made me question my worth. Mrs. Simmons lowered her gaze, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the folder. I didn't realize it came across that way," she said softly. "I thought I was being firm, not unfair." Marcus nodded. "I understand that might have been your intention. But intentions and outcomes aren't always the same. Your words and actions had a lasting impact on me, not just as a student, but as a person." He took a deep breath before continuing. "But I want to be clear about something. This conversation isn't about blaming you or holding a grudge. It's about understanding how our actions as educators shape the lives of the students we serve. We have the power to build them up or tear them down, and that's a responsibility we have to take seriously." Mrs. Simmons sat in silence for a moment, her eyes moist. I thought I was being a good teacher," she said finally. "I thought I was helping, but now I see I was wrong." Her voice broke slightly as she continued. "It wasn't just you, was it? There were other students I dismissed or underestimated because I thought they didn't fit the mold of what I considered success." Marcus didn't respond immediately, allowing her to process her thoughts. "I see them now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Their faces, their names, all the times I might have made them feel small, and I regret it deeply." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "Mrs. Simmons, we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do once we recognize them. Growth isn't about being perfect. It's about learning and doing better." He gestured toward the students walking outside his window. "Every day we have the chance to make a difference, to show our students that we believe in them, that we see their potential even when they don't see it themselves. It's not about lowering our standards. It's about meeting them where they are and helping them rise." Mrs. Simmons nodded slowly. "You're right," she said. "I've spent so much time focusing on what I thought students should be that I forgot to see them for who they are." Marcus smiled gently. "It's never too late to change, Mrs. Simmons. The fact that you're sitting here, willing to have this conversation, tells me that you care. And that's the first step." Mrs. Simmons looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for giving me the chance to reflect and grow, and thank you for not giving up on yourself, even when I couldn't see your potential." Marcus nodded. "I appreciate that. But this isn't about me. It's about the students who walk through these doors every day. Let's work together to make sure they all feel valued and supported, no matter where they come from or what challenges they face." As Mrs. Simmons left Marcus's office, she felt a mix of emotions: regret for the past, but also hope for the future. For the first time in years, she felt a genuine desire to change, to be the kind of teacher who uplifted her students rather than held them back. She spent the weekend revisiting her lesson plans, thinking about how she could make her classroom a place of encouragement and growth. That evening, Marcus sat in his office, jotting down notes about the meeting. He thought about how far he had come, not just as an educator, but as a person. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't about excusing someone's behavior. It was about freeing himself from the burden of anger. By showing grace to Mrs. Simmons, he had opened the door for her to grow and for the school to become a better place. Looking out the window, Marcus smiled. The journey hadn't been easy, but moments like these reminded him why it was all worth it. The first official day of the school year under Marcus's leadership began with a renewed sense of hope. As students filed into the halls, they noticed subtle but significant changes. Inspirational quotes adorned the walls, showcasing messages of perseverance, equality, and empowerment. The usual rigid atmosphere had softened, replaced with a feeling of possibility. Marcus made it a point to greet students and staff every morning at the front doors. His approachable demeanor and genuine interest in the school community set the tone for the transformation that was about to unfold. Marcus began his tenure as principal by introducing a series of policies aimed at leveling the playing field for all students, particularly those from underprivileged backgrounds. A fund was established to assist students with purchasing school supplies, uniforms, and other essentials. Local businesses and alumni were invited to contribute, creating a sustainable source of funding. Marcus implemented a mentorship initiative where older students and alumni mentored younger students. This program paired students who needed guidance with mentors who could offer academic and emotional support. Marcus launched free after-school programs focused on tutoring, arts, sports, and technology. Students who once struggled academically or socially now had opportunities to explore their interests and develop new skills. A new diversity council was formed, composed of teachers, students, and parents. The council's goal was to ensure that all voices were heard and respected. Cultural celebration days and events were introduced to promote understanding and appreciation of the school's diverse community. Marcus understood that creating a positive environment required empowering teachers as well. He introduced mandatory training programs focused on inclusivity, empathy, and modern teaching techniques. Teachers participated in workshops designed to address implicit bias and promote culturally responsive teaching methods. These sessions were led by experts and included real-world examples to help teachers connect theory to practice. Monthly empathy circles were held, where teachers could share their challenges and successes in a supportive environment. These sessions fostered collaboration and encouraged teachers to view their students through a more compassionate lens. Marcus introduced opportunities for teachers to attend conferences and enroll in advanced training programs. The school covered the costs, ensuring that every teacher had access to resources for professional growth. The changes in policy and training began to reflect in the classroom. Teachers adopted more engaging and inclusive methods of instruction, creating a safe space for students to express themselves. Lessons became more interactive, incorporating group projects, hands-on activities, and technology. Students who once felt left behind now had multiple ways to engage with the material. Marcus introduced a system to recognize student achievements, both big and small. Weekly announcements celebrated everything from academic excellence to acts of kindness, boosting morale and fostering a sense of community. Teachers began holding regular one-on-one meetings with students to discuss their progress and challenges. This open communication allowed students to feel heard and supported. The changes had a profound effect on the students. Students who once felt overlooked began to thrive. They raised their hands more often in class, participated in extracurricular activities, and took pride in their achievements. EST scores and grades improved across the board, particularly among students from underprivileged backgrounds. Marcus tracked the data closely, celebrating progress while identifying areas for further improvement. The school became a place where every student felt they belonged. Bullying incidents decreased, and students began supporting one another in ways that hadn't been seen before. The teachers, too, felt the impact of Marcus's leadership. Many teachers who had grown disillusioned with the profession found themselves re-energized. Marcus's vision reminded them why they had chosen to teach in the first place. The regular empathy circles and professional development opportunities fostered a stronger sense of collaboration among staff. Teachers began sharing ideas and resources, creating a more cohesive and supportive work environment. Marcus made a point to acknowledge the hard work of his staff, both privately and publicly. This recognition boosted morale and encouraged teachers to go the extra mile for their students. One of the most remarkable changes occurred in Mrs. Simmons. The conversation with Marcus had been a turning point for her. She spent weeks reflecting on her teaching practices and how her biases had affected her students. Mrs. Simmons began attending every training session and actively participated in discussions. She sought advice from colleagues and even invited Marcus to observe her classroom, asking for feedback. She started mentoring struggling students, offering encouragement and guidance rather than criticism. Her classroom became a space of growth and support, a far cry from the rigid environment it had once been. Marcus understood that a school's success was tied to its community, so he worked to strengthen those connections. Parent-teacher meetings became more frequent and focused on collaboration rather than confrontation. Marcus introduced workshops for parents on topics like supporting their children's education and navigating college applications. The school partnered with local businesses and nonprofits to provide internships, scholarships, and additional resources for students. The school began hosting events like cultural fairs, talent shows, and open houses, fostering a sense of pride and unity among students, parents, and staff. The transformation under Marcus's leadership did not go unnoticed. The school received accolades for its innovative programs and significant improvements in student performance. Local newspapers ran stories about the turnaround school and its inspiring principal. Families from neighboring districts began applying to enroll their children, drawn by the school's reputation for excellence and inclusivity. Other schools began reaching out to Marcus for advice, hoping to replicate his success. He happily shared his strategies, believing that every child deserved the same opportunities. One evening, Marcus walked through the halls of the school, now filled with vibrant murals painted by students. He stopped by the trophy case, where recent awards for academic and extracurricular achievements were proudly displayed. He thought back to his own days as a student in these same halls, remembering the challenges he had faced and the dreams he had dared to pursue. This, he thought to himself, is what I always wanted, for every student to feel like they matter, to know they can achieve anything. Marcus smiled as he heard laughter from a nearby classroom. The transformation was far from complete, but the progress was undeniable. Under Marcus's leadership, the school became a shining example of what was possible when respect, equality, and opportunity were prioritized. His vision inspired not just the students and staff, but the entire community. And as Marcus continued his work, he knew that the best was yet to come. It had been long but rewarding. Marcus sat in his office, the warm light of the setting sun filtering through the blinds and casting a golden glow across the room. His desk, neatly organized, bore the weight of papers, reports, and files, signs of the work he poured into his role as principal. But for now, his attention wasn't on the tasks ahead. It was on the small collection of personal items placed carefully on a shelf beside him. Reaching over, Marcus picked up a framed photograph of his family. The picture was slightly faded, but the smiles were as vibrant as ever. It had been taken years ago, back when they didn't have much but always made the best of what they had. His mother stood proudly in the center, her arm wrapped around Marcus's younger siblings, while his father stood tall, his hand resting on Marcus's shoulder. He ran his fingers gently over the edge of the frame, his thoughts drifting to the sacrifices his parents had made to ensure he had every opportunity to succeed. They had believed in him, even when others didn't. Setting the photograph down, Marcus turned his attention to a well-worn notebook that had been with him since his teenage years. The cover was frayed, and the pages were slightly yellowed, but it was one of his most treasured possessions. Opening it to the first page, he saw the bold words he had written all those years ago. Below it were the goals he had set for himself: graduate with honors, attend college, become a school principal, make a difference. Marcus smiled as he read the words. At the time, they had felt almost impossible. He remembered sitting at his small desk in the shared bedroom he had with his younger brother, writing those goals late at night, fueled by determination and a hint of desperation. He flipped through the pages, each one filled with notes, plans, and reflections from his journey. Some entries were hopeful, others written in moments of doubt, but all of them painted a picture of resilience. Marcus leaned back in his chair, letting his mind wander through the memories of his journey. He thought about the challenges he had faced: Mrs. Simmons' cutting words, the financial struggles, the long nights balancing work and studies. Each obstacle had shaped him, forcing him to grow stronger and more determined. He thought about the people who had supported him along the way, his family, his friends, mentors like Mr. Carter and Dr. Patel. Their belief in him had been a lifeline, reminding him that he wasn't alone. And then there were the students he had encountered as a teacher and now as a principal. They were the reason he had fought so hard, the reason he woke up every morning ready to give his best. Marcus placed the notebook back on the shelf and stood, looking out the window. The schoolyard was quiet now, the students and staff having gone home for the day. The stillness of the moment allowed him to fully appreciate how far he had come. "Thank you," he whispered softly, though he wasn't sure who the words were meant for, his parents, his mentors, or perhaps the version of himself who had refused to give up. Deciding to take a final walk through the school before leaving, Marcus grabbed his jacket and stepped out of his office. The halls were empty, but the energy of the day still lingered. As he walked, he noticed small but meaningful signs of the transformation the school had undergone. A bulletin board displayed artwork and essays from students, each one brimming with creativity and pride. A quote painted on the wall caught his eye. Marcus smiled. The students had chosen that quote as part of a school-wide project, and it perfectly encapsulated the vision he had for this place. He passed by classrooms, now quiet, but still holding the echoes of laughter and learning. He thought about the teachers who had embraced his vision, the students who had begun to believe in their own potential, and even Mrs. Simmons, who had taken significant steps toward growth and redemption. As Marcus turned a corner, he saw a group of students working on a mural in the hallway. Though the school day was over, they had stayed late to finish the project. "Good evening, Principal Johnson," one of the students said, looking up from her painting. "Good evening," Marcus replied warmly. "This looks incredible. Great work, all of you." "Thanks," another student said. "We wanted to make something that shows what our school stands for now." Marcus stepped closer to examine the mural. It depicted a tree with deep roots and branches that stretched toward the sky. Each branch bore words like respect, equality, opportunity, and growth. Around the tree were students of all backgrounds, standing together, their faces filled with hope. "It's perfect," Marcus said, his voice filled with pride. As he continued walking, Marcus greeted the janitor cleaning the floors, the security guard locking up the doors, and a teacher preparing for the next day. Each interaction reminded him of the community he was now part of, a community he had worked so hard to build and uplift. He reached the main entrance and paused, looking out at the empty parking lot. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the last rays of sunlight casting a warm glow over the school. A voiceover filled with Marcus's thoughts began to play. Life is a journey filled with challenges and triumphs. Along the way, there will be those who doubt you, who try to limit your potential. But your worth is not defined by their words. It's defined by your determination, your resilience, and your belief in yourself. The scene shifted to show Marcus walking through the halls, the smile on his face reflecting his pride and gratitude. As educators, as leaders, as people, it is our responsibility to see the potential in others, to nurture it, and to create an environment where everyone has the opportunity to succeed. That is how we change the world. One student, one moment, one act of kindness at a time. The voiceover faded as Marcus stepped outside, the camera pulling back to reveal the school behind him, its walls now a beacon of hope for the community. And with that, the story ended, not as a conclusion, but as the beginning of a new chapter in the legacy Marcus had worked so hard to build.